My name is Elise Hartford, and sometimes life, well, it turns out to be quite the storyteller, weaving tales you never expected to live through. Years back, a motorcycle crash claimed the freedom of my legs, but it failed to dent my resolve. Now at 38, I've crafted a life within the confines of my wheelchair that many could envy, providing I leave out the part about my soon-to-be ex-husband, Jack. Our first encounter spun from the well-intentioned meddling of friends determined to play Cupid. It resulted in a blind date that, to my genuine surprise, sparked genuine excitement. Jack stood out like a sore thumb, not just from the awkwardness that typically surrounds first meetings, but from his unabashed inquisitiveness. While others tiptoed around the obvious, Jack cannonballed right in with a barrage of questions about my day-to-day life. His bluntness, masked as genuine concern, was a refreshing break from the usual tiptoeing tactfulness I encountered daily. Questions ranged from how I managed my meals to how I navigated a shower. Each inquiry drew us closer, a couple of like-minded souls, or so I thought. Rare as it felt, I imagined Jack's interest in me, wheelchair and all, wasn't just a fluke but something profound. We teetered along the path of dating, me losing myself in his presence. Each date wrote a new chapter until one day, hardly 6 months into knowing each other, he knelt, ring in hand, offering me a forever. My heart swelled, daring to embrace the joy I thought life had selfishly steered away from me. The dream, the promise of a life shared, began to unravel almost immediately after tying the knot. Eager to shape our joined lives, we picked my cozy, wheelchair-friendly rental as our home. It was pricey, but designed to accommodate my needs seamlessly, a critical factor that won me over. Somehow, the space that once seemed so mine distorted into a cold showcase as Jack occupied it, his chores neglected, his interest in my welfare dwindling as days passed. Help, when asked, was always met with a tired, maybe later. The real responsibilities of a marriage, the shared efforts required, seemed lost on him. And before long, the harsh truth stared me right in the face. Jack's commitment was a mirage, sprinkled with all smiles and not much else. Companionship faded, replaced with resentment and, even worse, doubt. His lack of employment and newfound nightlife were less shocking than the gut-wrenching realization that I might have been nothing more than a convenience in his life. An independent woman able to cater to herself, and unfortunately, now, to him as well. Seeking help, I turned to Jack's mother, hoping for some insight, maybe some solidarity. Our conversations, though, always veered back to excusing her son's behavior. My longing for family pushed me into a corner of self-reliance and isolation. I was surviving, not living. And then Jack, the man I had graciously invited into my independent world, dropped the bombshell. My parents should move in, and you? There are facilities for that. My world, which had already started to crumble, finally broke apart. It was then I knew, amidst the decaying fragments of this farcical marriage, I had a choice. And as the encroaching reality of losing not just a husband but my home dawned on me, something fierce awoke. It wasn't time to mourn, but to act. I was about to rewrite my narrative, and this time, Jack wouldn't be a character in it. The following days blended one into another with quiet chaos brewing beneath the surface. The idea of bringing his parents into our home dangled over my head, a suffocating proposal. I could almost envision our small sanctuary turning into a crowded habitat where my needs would be sidelined, a place where my voice would be but an echo fading into the backdrop of daily family life. But the real blow came from Jack's flippant remark, almost meandering in the air with my unsaid words. "Have you thought about moving into a facility?" he suggested, like it was the most natural solution in the world. The word facility stung as it hung in the air. It reeked of a particular kind of finality, the erasure of the life I'd known from the place I'd shaped for myself. A facility? His eagerness for me to even consider it felt like a betrayal in itself. I needed time to think this over, digest the audacity, foresee the implications. But time was a luxury Jack was unwilling to afford me. He moved with a decisiveness that caught me off guard. Before I could take a breath to process it all, there they were, his parents, surveying their son's proposition as if it were already a done deal. The certainty of decision in their eyes made my heart sink. This was not a simple visit. They were there to measure curtains and count the amenities and marvel at how comfortably I lived. Perhaps they saw a woman who had things material, a woman who could be conveniently displaced for their comfort. It all started to click, the unsaid thoughts between Jack's spontaneous questions on our first date, the rapidity with which our relationship escalated, and now this sudden upheaval. Was I always just a means to an end for him? Selfish, Jack called me when I pushed back on his proposal, as if my desire to retain some semblance of control over my own living situation was undue vanity. I was suddenly the outsider here, the inconvenience in my own home. "Why can't you think of others for once?" he'd retort, creating ripples of guilt meant to weaken my resolve. But something had shifted within me. The word facility had triggered an awakening, a fierce refusal to be shunted aside. It was the spark that reignited my smothered self-respect. That night, lying awake in a bed too big for the shrinking space between us, my mind raced through the years of independence before Jack and the true loneliness that now enveloped me. Empowered with clarity, I began to formulate my escape. The first light of morning brought a new Elise, one who was ready to reclaim her life. A phone call to a knowledgeable real estate agent set the wheels in motion. I looked around what was once a comforting haven and declared an internal farewell. It was clearer than ever. The supposed big deal of moving into a facility was the underpinning of my rebellion. It was the catalyst, a declaration that I would no longer be the backdrop to someone else's convenience. I would not silently slip away into the obscurities of care homes and faded memories. True, I was scared of the loneliness that might ensue, but my spirit, it seemed, would settle for nothing less than the unapologetic pursuit of respect. Jack's careless, visible threads were being pulled, and I was the one unraveling the whole charade. The intervention was swift and necessary, like the quick pull of a bandage. My heart had carried a hope that Jack's stark suggestion was just a misstep, a blunder born out of a misplaced understanding of what constitutes family and support. But as I watched his parents leave with easy grins and Jack's triumphant look, I knew the truth was much bleaker. Their intentions for my home, their lack of concern for my well-being, painted a vivid picture of opportunism masquerading as family unity. The sharp realization stung me awake. I was alone in my matrimonial boat, and it was swiftly sinking. I drafted my plan during the quiet moments when the house was left to me. I visualized the steps I would take, reaching for a future where I upheld my independence, far from the chaos that Jack and his family threatened. I began to see the outlines of a life without Jack, a life where I steered the ship and the horizon gleamed with possibilities, not restrictions. That night, I lay awake, not in dread but in fierce determination. Tomorrow I would make my move. Morning brought a flurry of phone calls. First, to the real estate agent to inform him of my situation and to initiate the search for a new house. I couldn't help but relish in the professionalism of his voice, a stark contrast to the recent petty squabbling with Jack. Next, I contacted a moving service, scheduling a date for them to haul away every piece that belonged to me. I approached the following days with a machine-like efficiency, carefully sorting through my belongings into two categories: essentials and dispensables. My essentials fit into neatly packed boxes, labeled and ready for transport. Everything else, the dispensable pieces of past comfort, I offered up for donation. It was a purge of not just material possessions, but of the internal baggage that had weighed down my resolve for far too long. When Jack finally returned, he found a house in silent upheaval. I met his bewildered gaze with a poised calmness that felt alien, yet empowering. "What's happening, Elise?" he asked, taking in the stacked boxes and empty shelves. "We're getting a divorce, Jack. I'm moving out," I said, extending the business card of a lawyer to him. The words felt surreal, detached from the person who, not long ago, still clung to the hope of for better or for worse. Jack reacted as though winded, staggering slightly, as if the stability he took for granted had been ripped away under his feet. There was pleading in his eyes, the recognition of his missteps spurring him to salvage what he could. But I no longer saw my husband in him. I saw the architect of my disillusionment. "Elise, you need me. Think this through. Where will you go?" He blurred, his concern tinged with self-interest. I squared my shoulders, my resolve hardening. "I've thought it through, Jack, perhaps more thoroughly than you ever have. As for where I'm going, that's no longer your concern." He spat questions and half-formed arguments, each one falling flat against the wall of my silent rebuttal. With every dismantled appliance and packed box, the life we shared was being methodically erased. It was a profound erasure, one I watched with an impassive heart. Jack's presence, once a colossal part of my existence, shrank to nothing more than a silhouette against the memories I was leaving behind. This was the moment of clarity I'd sought, not from the guidance of friends or in the reflections of Jack's mother's eyes, but from the deep well of resilience that my disability had always demanded. As Jack eventually fell into sullen silence, I turned away, a step closer to a life where trepidation was replaced by the excitement of newfound freedom. The day had arrived, the movers came, and the last of my belongings were carefully transferred to a safe storage unit. Standing in what once was a sanctuary and now felt like a mausoleum, I surveyed the hollowed-out space, barren of the warmth it once held. The home's stillness was only disrupted by the soft echo of my wheelchair rolling over the hardwood floors. I had reclaimed the remnants of my independence, tarnished by a marriage I was now leaving behind. Tension hovered like a shroud as Jack watched this dismantling of the life we made, or rather the life I made for him. His face, once an emblem of partnership, now seemed like a distant memory, washed out by the stark reality of our divorce proceedings. "I don't understand," he muttered under his breath, a mix of disbelief and angst crossing his features as he followed the movers carrying out the couch, the dining table, the bed we shared for what seemed like a momentary lapse in our lives. "It's simple, Jack," I replied without turning to face him, my voice steady as the movers worked. "Everything here was mine before you, and now I'm taking it back." "But this is our home," Jack insisted, his voice a crescendo of desperation and confusion. "Where am I supposed to sleep? What about your promise?" "Our home?" I echoed, tilting my head ever so slightly in his direction. "No, Jack, this was never our home. You just lived here. As for promises, the ones made at the altar turned to dust the moment you considered me expendable enough to replace with a facility." His rebuttal was quickly stifled as another piece of what was once considered ours was taken away. He stood rooted, grappling with the impending void that he was never prepared to fill on his own. My precision was surgical. Nothing that bore my touch, my ownership, was left for him to hold on to. As Jack scrambled to salvage a semblance of normalcy from the ruins, I already navigated the contours of my new beginning. After the final box had been loaded and the movers' footsteps had faded away, only the two of us remained. Jack's complaints had quieted down to murmurs, his former resolve crumbling as he walked through the open space, reckoning with the reality before him. The house, once vibrant with my laughter and my efforts, stood there naked, stripped bare, echoing back nothing but his own confounded sorrow. "I'll sleep on the floor if I have to," he declared, though more to himself than to me, his voice hollow. "You do what you must, Jack," I replied, meeting his gaze for perhaps the last time. "I'll do the same," with a greater commitment than I'd felt in a long time, greater, perhaps, than on our wedding day. I turned my wheelchair towards the door. This exit was no retreat. It was a march towards self-restoration. The cold air outside welcomed me like an old friend as I rolled down the ramp from the porch, the ramp that was built for my benefit that also became my path to escape. I allowed myself one last glance back at that hollow building, the house drained of its soul, as I headed to the beginning of the rest of my life. As I hummed a tune of freedom and drove away, the sight of Jack standing in an empty frame, the embodiment of unraveled plans and misplaced expectations, faded into a memory. The marked end of an era and the final unraveling of Jack's entwined deceptions. The silence in the aftermath was as profound as the decision that steered me there. Freedom isn't just a state of being. It's a quiet revolution in moments of confronting one's own truths and decisions. As I settled into temporary accommodations, a compact yet undeniably mine-rented apartment, I savored solitude's sweet flavor. Jack and his parents were left to face the reality of a home that was no longer hospitable. All the plush comforts which I had accumulated over years of independent living and smart saving, now gone with me, were but lingering scents in the air. It didn't take long for Jack to reach out, a hint of desperation hidden behind a veneer of indignation in his voice over the phone. "Elise, What about the appliances, the TV, the fridge? You left me with nothing. I paused, the words tumbling in my mind before forming a response. Jack, those were mine. Bought with my money for my life. You were just sharing them with me. Now that we're done, I've taken them back. Simple. But where does that leave me? He demanded, his voice cracking as the facade began to crumble. That's something you should have considered before making assumptions about my home, my generosity, and my willingness to be discarded, I replied evenly. Jack, this is the reckoning. He was silent for a moment, the weight of the situation undoubtedly resting heavily on his conscience, if he'd found it by then. I can't live in an empty house. I can't afford to replace everything, he finally admitted. I'm sure you'll manage, I said with finality. This was not my problem. It wasn't my duty to furnish his life with comfort. My responsibilities toward Jack had ended the moment he chose his convenience over our partnership. I could almost hear him pacing, the sound transporting me back to the many nights I would listen to him roaming our now empty house, full of plans that never included my well-being. The rent, Elise. It's due soon, and without the furniture, I can't make this place work. The lease was always in my name, Jack. I've taken care of this month, but you're on your own after that. You should look for somewhere more within your means. But what about us? He asked, a tremor in his voice. Jack, there is no us anymore. You made sure of that. I hung up, feeling not the twinge of regret I'd anticipated, but a surge of relief. The next step was to inform my real estate agent that the lease wouldn't be renewed. I wanted to cut all remaining ties to that house and the suffocating stranglehold it represented. I took a deep breath, opening the windows to let in the fresh air, and dialed the number. Hello, it's Elise Hartford. I won't be renewing the lease for the property on Willow Lane. Please begin the process of finding new tenants. The cord tying me to that phase of my life was severed, and with it went Jack and his assumptions of continued support. Days later, I received the news. The house was back on the market, and Jack, along with his parents, would have to vacate. They had pleaded, tried to negotiate terms they could never fulfill, but in the end, reality reasserted itself. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I found comfort in the simplicity of my apartment, the space void of grandeur but brimming with potential for a new story, my story. The reckoning had come, not as an apocalyptic conclusion, but a necessary release, freeing me to refine the edges of my life into something wholly, authentically mine. The transition was quieter than I had anticipated, etched more with a sense of normalcy than the emotional upheaval I had braced for. Within my new apartment, each morning delivered a promise, subtle and soft like the daylight that eased through my curtains. Jack's shadow had all but faded, and the echoes of his family's protests had long since dissolved into the backdrop of my past. It wasn't long before I heard of Jack's latest ploy, a final, feeble attempt at reconciliation. But unlike before, the news brought no churn of emotion, only a mild curiosity at what lengths desperation might drive him to next. True to form, he arrived at my doorstep, unannounced and unsettling in his disarray. His clothes spoke of his new hardship, a silent, self-inflicted penance. Elise, he began, the familiar strain in his tone now underscored with a hint of humility. We've nowhere to go. The apartment, the lease, it's all ending. You can't leave us like this. I already have, Jack. My response was measured, devoid of the anger and bitterness that once fueled our interactions. Your parents, their welfare, that's on you now. That's your family, Jack, not mine. But you have so much space here, just a corner, just enough to... His voice trailed, a plea that dwindled into the growing distance between us. Enough for what, Jack? To forget who left whom out to dry? To overlook the fact that in a choice between a partner and an easy life, you chose the latter? I almost felt sorry for him, standing there, a makeshift echo of the man I'd married. But pity had no place in the life I was building, unencumbered and honest in its simplicity. I had chosen a path of self-respect which left no room for the ghosts of failures past to take residence again. Go back to them, Jack. They need you. They've always needed you more than me. With that, I closed the door, both figurative and literal, on a chapter that no longer served me. The days that ensued were filled with mundane joys, a coffee sipped in quiet, a book read uninterrupted, and a dinner enjoyed in solitary satisfaction. There was a peace in being alone, unbound by expectation, or the whims of another. Life in my new place unfolded with an ease I had almost forgotten possible. Each corner of the apartment bore my choices exclusively, each item placed with deliberate care and consideration, and as I rolled through these rooms, they felt more than just a physical space. They were a testament to an identity reclaimed. The news of Jack and his parents faded into just that, news. Stories told over fences and across grocery aisles about the family who lost everything. About Jack, the man who realized too late that the woman he had was more than just another fixture in his complacent existence. This fresh start, it was more than a new home. It was my declaration. A statement to anyone who'd care to know, and especially to myself, that worth isn't granted by another's presence, but affirmed by our strength to stand, or in my case, roll alone, whole and undiminished. As I settled for the night, I caught my reflection in the mirror. The familiar sight of a wheelchair-bound woman stared back, but now she smiled, eyes clear with the knowledge that her best days awaited not behind her, but ahead, unfettered and bright with the prospect of a true new beginning.